When we imagine the Roman Empire, our minds often go straight to the thunder of marching legions, the clash of shields, or the roar of victory in far-off lands. But behind all of that noise, behind the maps of conquests and the stories of emperors, there was something quieter, something that rarely finds its way into history books. There was the daily life of the ordinary soldier. What was it like to wake up inside a Roman military camp? What did a soldier eat before marching for miles? How did he pass the long hours of training, of guard duty, of waiting for orders that might never come? These are the small, almost invisible details. Yet together, they built the discipline and endurance that allowed Rome to hold an empire stretching across continents. The strength of Rome was not only in its generals or its emperors. It was in the silent routines of thousands of men whose names history does not remember. Tonight, we will not stand on battlefields. We will not hear the clash of swords. Instead, we will step gently into the quiet world of the Roman soldier's daily life. We will follow him from the moment he rises in the morning to the moment he rests beneath the stars, his armor stacked neatly by his side. We will see how his hours were filled not only with war, but with discipline, order, work, and small fragments of humanity that connected him to a world beyond the empire's endless marches. As you settle into rest, let the noise of the day drift away. Imagine the soft flicker of a campfire, the low murmur of soldiers sharing bread, the rhythmic sound of boots marching down a dusty road. This is not the story of great battles, but the quiet heartbeat of an empire. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history's forgotten corners, remember to like and subscribe, so the next story may find you again. Now, let us begin. The sun rises slowly over the camp, and with it, another day in the life of a Roman soldier begins. The camp of a Roman legion at dawn was a place of quiet order. Long before the noise of marching boots or the shouts of commanders, there was the soft stirring of thousands of men waking in unison, each one part of a greater machine that stretched across the empire. Imagine rows upon rows of tents, set with mathematical precision, forming neat streets within wooden walls. Every tent housed 8 soldiers, their gear stacked neatly beside them, their shields leaning in order against the canvas, their sandals placed carefully at the foot of their bedding. The order of the camp was no accident. It was the first and most enduring lesson of a Roman soldier's life. Discipline began not on the battlefield, but in the silence of routine. As the sun rose slowly over the horizon, the first sounds were not shouts or trumpets, but the soft rustle of men rolling from their simple beds of straw. There was no luxury in a legionary's rest. His blanket was thin, his body often weary from the day before, his sleep easily broken by the cold of night or the sounds of others moving nearby. Yet he rose with the same calm certainty as the man beside him, because the rhythm of life in the camp allowed for no hesitation. Each morning began the same. Rise quickly, pack away bedding, and prepare the body and the mind for the day ahead. Point one by one. Men folded their blankets and stacked them neatly, then reached for their sandals. Heavy, hobnailed caligy designed not for comfort, but for endurance. The sound of leather straps tightening, of buckles being secured, filled the tents like a hushed chorus. Armor was inspected even before it was worn. A dent in a helmet or a strap out of place could mean disaster later. Legionaries lived with the knowledge that their survival depended not only on strength, but on preparation. And so even in the quiet of dawn, there was no carelessness. Outside, the camp itself stirred awake. Fires from the night before smoldered low, their smoke rising in thin trails against the pale sky. The air carried the faint scent of bread, coarse loaves baked from the grain each soldier carried as part of his rations. A Roman soldier did not wait for servants to feed him. He baked, cooked, and prepared his own meals, often in groups, sharing the simple labor that tied them together as comrades. Breakfast was never a feast. It was hard bread, perhaps softened in water or wine, and a small portion of cheese or porridge if supplies allowed. To modern eyes, it was meager. To the soldier, it was enough to sustain him through hours of marching, drilling, or building a S-men-aid. The camp grew louder, though still in an orderly hum. Commands were spoken, not shouted, for there was little need. Each man knew his place, his duty, and the rhythm of the morning. Shields were lifted, swords checked, belts tightened. Spears were examined for cracks, sandals adjusted once more. The tools of war were not only weapons but also shovels, picks, and axes, for a Roman soldier was as much a builder as he was a fighter. Even in the earliest hours, the knowledge that the day might bring labor as easily as battle hung in the air. Trumpets eventually broke the calm, their clear sound signaling the official beginning of the day. It was a sound that stirred every man into final readiness. Within moments, the camp transformed from quiet waking into purposeful motion. Lines formed as soldiers emerged from tents, their shields gleaming faintly in the new light, their helmets catching the glow of dawn. Officers walked the rows, eyes sharp, checking each detail. There was little tolerance for laziness or disarray. A man whose gear was unkempt or whose pace was slow brought shame not only on himself, but on his entire unit. Discipline was shared. The failure of one reflected upon all, and yet, within this rigid order, there was a sense of companionship. Soldiers joked quietly as they adjusted their armor, offered help to a comrade whose strap was too tight, or shared the last crumbs of bread from a meal. These small gestures mattered, for in a world where each man lived shoulder to shoulder with others, bonds were as essential as weapons. The morning routine was not only about discipline, but about unity. A legion could only march and fight as one if it woke and prepared as one. To the outsider, the life of a Roman soldier may have seemed harsh, even joyless. Rising at dawn, eating coarse bread, checking gear with relentless attention, all of it spoke of hardship. But for the soldier, this was life, a rhythm so ingrained that it gave meaning and stability to days filled with uncertainty. Wars might be won or lost, lands conquered or abandoned, but the routine of the morning was eternal. It grounded the legionary in something larger than himself, connecting him to the thousands of others who rose with him, who marched beside him, who trusted him to be ready when the time came. Thus, the awakening of a Roman camp was more than a simple routine. It was the quiet heartbeat of an empire, repeated in countless dawns across centuries. From the banks of the Rhine to the sands of the desert, from the cold frontiers of Britain to the warm hills of Italy, soldiers woke the same way, quickly, quietly, with discipline and unity. And in that silent rising, the strength of Rome was renewed each day. The strength of Rome did not rest only on the sharpness of its swords or the discipline of its formations. It rested also on bread, on porridge, on the simple meals that sustained thousands of men as they marched across continents. The daily food of a Roman soldier was not rich, nor was it meant to delight. It was fuel, plain and steady, designed to keep the body moving when miles stretched long ahead and the weight of armor pressed heavily on tired shoulders. Yet within these small, unchanging meals lay the quiet foundation of Rome's endurance. Each soldier carried with him a portion of grain, usually wheat, stored in a leather sack as part of his standard kit. This grain was not handed out daily by cooks or servants. It was his responsibility to prepare, and it formed the base of nearly every meal. At the break of dawn, after rising from straw bedding and tightening the straps of his sandals, the legionary turned to the most important task of the morning, turning grain into sustenance. There were no kitchens in the camp, no fires tended by others. Each group of 8 men, called a contubernium, gathered around their own small fire, grinding grain on handheld stones, mixing flour with water, and baking rough loaves on heated stones or in simple clay ovens if the camp was permanent enough to build them. The bread that emerged was nothing like the soft loaves we know today. It was coarse, heavy, often gritty with fragments of husk left in the flour. Biting into it could wear down teeth, and many soldiers bore the marks of years spent chewing on such bread. Yet it was filling, and that was what mattered. Alongside bread, porridge was a common meal. Grain boiled in water until it thickened into a rough gruel could be eaten quickly and digested easily. Sometimes salt was added, sometimes herbs if they could be found, but more often it was plain. A bland mixture that provided strength without joy. Cheese, dried fruit, and vegetables occasionally supplemented the soldier's diet. A piece of hard cheese might be carried from one camp to another, its sharpness breaking the monotony of bread. If stationed near towns or fertile lands, soldiers might purchase onions, olives, or beans from locals. These small additions were treasured, for they brought flavor to an otherwise repetitive diet. Meat was rare and often tied to special occasions. The slaughter of an animal was not an everyday event, but something reserved for celebration, reward, or necessity during campaigns. Most soldiers went weeks without tasting it, relying instead on their bread, their gruel, and the steady rhythm of grain. Wine, watered down and carried in skins, was another constant. Soldiers did not drink it for luxury, but for safety, for water was not always clean. A little wine mixed with water reduced the risk of illness and gave a faint taste to the drink that cut through monotony. It was not drunkenness that marked the soldier's use of wine, but practicality. Too much would be punished, for discipline demanded clarity. But a steady supply ensured hydration and a measure of comfort during long days of labor and march. Meals were taken in groups, shared among the contubernium. The 8 men who shared a tent also shared their food. Bread was divided, porridge stirred in the same pot, wine poured into cups passed hand to hand. This act of eating together was more than necessity. It was another thread of unity, binding men who might have come from different regions of the empire into something closer to family. Around these small fires, in the quiet moments of chewing and drinking, bonds were built as surely as they were on the battlefield. Stories were told, laughter rose softly, silence was shared when weariness made words unnecessary. The simple act of eating became a ritual of belonging. Food was also a lesson in endurance. There was no choice, no variety, no luxury. A soldier ate what he was given, and he ate it without complaint. Complaints could spread unrest, and unrest weakened unity. So the legionary learned to chew his coarse bread in silence, to swallow his plain gruel with patience, to find strength in monotony. This discipline carried into every part of his life. Just as he endured long marches, heavy loads, and harsh weather, he endured simple meals, accepting them as part of his duty. In this way, the diet of a Roman soldier shaped not only his body, but his mind out on the march. Meals were even more austere. Soldiers carried their rations with them, eating as they rested along the road. Bread might be hardened into biscuit-like form for travel, dipped into water or wine to soften it. A handful of olives or dried figs might provide variation, but often it was only bread and water, taken quickly before moving on. Fires could not always be built, and so meals became even simpler, reminding soldiers that survival, not comfort, was the measure of their lives. Yet in this harsh simplicity, there was also resilience. Soldiers rarely went hungry unless supply lines failed, for the empire had mastered the art of moving grain. Roads, carts, ships, and storehouses ensured that armies could be fed even in distant lands. This constant supply of grain, plain though it was, allowed Rome's armies to march farther, endure longer, and fight harder than many of their enemies. A soldier who ate bread and porridge day after day did not grow weaker for it. He grew used to it, built strength from it, and carried on without distraction. When night fell, the day often ended as it began, with the simple preparation of food. Fires flickered once more, pots of porridge bubbled, loaves were baked or reheated, wine was poured into cups. The men of each tent gathered again, eating in the same quiet rhythm as they had in the morning. For all the hardship, there was comfort in this repetition, in knowing that tomorrow would bring the same bread, the same gruel, the same silence around the same fire. In a world filled with uncertainty, battles, marches, commands that could change lives, the certainty of food, plain and steady, was its own kind of anchor. Thus, the daily meals of the Roman soldier were not a story of delicacy or luxury, but of endurance. Bread that wore down teeth, porridge that filled the belly, wine that ensured safety. These were the quiet foundations of empire. Without them, no legion could have marched across the world. Without them, no soldier could have endured the endless roads. In the simplicity of their food lay the strength of Rome. Repeated in countless camps across centuries, a silent rhythm of chewing, swallowing, and enduring that carried the empire farther than swords alone ever could. The daily strength of a Roman legion did not begin with the clash of swords or the raising of shields on the battlefield. It began much earlier, in the quiet rhythm of preparing one's body for the weight it would carry. For a Roman soldier, dressing for the day was not a matter of vanity or comfort, but of survival. Every strap, every buckle, every piece of iron or leather was essential. To leave something undone, to neglect even a small detail, was to place one's life, and the life of comrades, at risk. And so, the act of putting on armor became one of the most disciplined routines of a legionary's existence. Performed with care, patience, and an almost ritual seriousness that a soldier began with the simplest garment, the tunic. It was a short woolen piece, rough against the skin, practical rather than luxurious. Well scratched, but it also endured, keeping its shape through long marches, heavy sweat, and harsh weather. Over this, soldiers sometimes tied a belt, keeping the fabric close to the body, making it easier to move beneath the layers of protection that would come next. Sandals, the calligi, were already on his feet, thick-soled and studded with hobnails that bit into the earth, giving grip on dusty roads, grassy fields, or muddy ground. Each step in these sandals echoed with the sound of iron on stone, a reminder that the legion's march was built as much on footwear as on discipline. Next came the armor itself. The most iconic was the larica segmentata, a suit of overlapping iron strips fastened with leather straps and metal hooks. To wear it required patience. Each piece was set carefully across the shoulders, fitted tightly around the torso, then fastened and adjusted until the plates overlapped just enough to allow movement without leaving weakness. It was heavy, pressing down on the shoulders, constricting the chest, making breathing deeper and slower. Yet it was protection against the spear and the sword, and so its weight was accepted. Soldiers grew used to it, their bodies hardened by daily use, their minds trained to ignore its burden. Not every soldier wore this exact armor. Some had chainmail, others scale armor, but all carried weight upon their chests that became as familiar as the beating of their hearts. The helmet, or galea, followed, forged from iron or bronze, lined with padding. It fitted snugly over the head, with cheek pieces that framed the face and a neck guard that curved down to shield the back. It was not comfortable. It pressed against the skull, limited vision at the sides, and trapped heat beneath its dome. Yet when the sun glinted on its polished surface, when its crest caught the light, it was a sign of readiness, a signal that the man who wore it was no longer just himself, but part of Rome's living wall of iron. To lift the helmet each morning was to feel its weight settle like a second skull, heavy yet protective, binding the soldier more deeply to his duty. The shield, or scutum, was the soldier's constant companion. Large, curved, and rectangular, made of wood bound with leather and rimmed in iron. It was less a piece of armor than an extension of the man himself. To carry, it was to carry safety, for it turned the legion into a wall that few enemies could break. Soldiers painted their shields with symbols of their units, bright colors and bold designs that made each group distinct, yet united them in battle. In the morning, as shields were lifted from where they rested against the tent walls, men would inspect their surfaces for cracks, repair straps, and test their weight. To a soldier, the shield was not only a tool of defense, but also a burden. It was heavy, awkward, and tiring to hold for long hours. And yet, without it, no soldier was complete. Weapons came next. The gladius, a short sword made for stabbing rather than slashing, worn at the side. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear designed to bend on impact, carried with care. And the pugio, a small dagger, often tucked at the belt. Each weapon had its place, each one checked daily. A dull edge could be sharpened, a loose hilt tightened, a splintered shaft repaired. The Roman soldier did not wait for battle to discover flaws. His survival depended on readiness, and so the act of dressing was as much about inspection as it was about equipping to be by the time all was secured, the tunic beneath, the armor fastened, the helmet adjusted, the sword at the belt, the shield at hand. The soldier stood transformed. He was no longer a man rising from a bed of straw, no longer simply one of thousands. He was a piece of a greater whole, iron and discipline bound together. The weight pressed down on his body, sometimes as much as 30 kilograms carried between armor, weapons, and gear. Yet he bore it without complaint. To complain was weakness. To endure was expected. Each man accepted the burden because each knew the burden was shared. The act of dressing was not loud or rushed. It was steady, calm, methodical. The sounds of buckles fastening, of leather creaking, of iron shifting against iron, filled the camp in a low murmur. Officers passed among the men, checking, correcting, demanding order. Comrades assisted one another, adjusting straps, securing helmets, tightening belts. These quiet acts of cooperation were invisible on the battlefield, yet they were what allowed the legion to function. A wall of shields could not stand unless each man had secured his own first, and unless each had trusted his neighbor to have done the same. To modern eyes, the daily donning of armor might seem oppressive, a reminder of hardship. But to the legionary, it was also a source of identity. The armor separated him from the farmer, the craftsman, the merchant. It marked him as a soldier of Rome, one of the men whose discipline carried the empire's borders across the world. It was a burden, yes, but it was also pride. Beneath the weight of iron, a man carried not only his own life, but the honor of his legion, the power of his empire. Thus, each morning in the Roman camp was marked not by shouts or chaos, but by this slow, deliberate transformation. From the softness of straw bedding to the hardness of iron plates, from the quiet of dawn to the clink of metal, a soldier became once again what the empire demanded him to be. And though the burden was heavy, though the straps cut into shoulders and the helmet pressed into skin, he bore it as naturally as he bore the rising of the sun. For the armor was not only his defense, it was his duty, his burden, and his identity. The true test of a Roman soldier was not always in the clash of battle, nor in the weight of armor worn from dawn until dusk. The greatest test, repeated day after day, came in the endless march. To serve in the legions was to walk, not once, not occasionally, but constantly, for miles that stretched into hundreds, for roads that seemed to have no end. The Roman Empire itself was bound together by these marches. The roads that cut through fields, forests, mountains, and deserts were carved by the feet of men whose lives were measured not in victories, but in steps that a Roman soldier carried on his back what felt like half his life. His armor, shield, weapons, tools, rations, and personal belongings could weigh as much as 30 kilograms, sometimes more. This load turned each march into a trial of endurance. Yet the soldier did not complain. He adjusted the straps of his pack, tightened his belt, and stepped forward because forward was the only direction. The discipline of the legion was built on this movement, this quiet, relentless pace that drove armies across continents. It was said that a legion could march 20 miles in a single day, then still have strength enough to build a fortified camp before resting. That rhythm, repeated endlessly, was what allowed Rome to reach the edges of the known world. Imagine the sight: a line of men stretching for miles, their helmets glinting faintly in the sun, their shields strapped to their backs, their sandals striking the earth in unison. Dust rose around them, settling on their tunics, coating their skin in a thin layer of grit. The air filled with the steady thud of boots, the low creak of leather, the occasional clink of metal. There was little talk. Words wasted breath, and breath was precious. The silence of the march was broken only by commands shouted by officers, or the calls of horns signaling changes in pace or direction. It was not the silence of rest, but the silence of determination. Each man focused on his steps, his load, his endurance. The roads themselves were both a blessing and a burden. Rome's engineers had built them with skill, laying stones and gravel in straight, enduring lines that still mark the earth today. On such roads, the march was steady, predictable, but not all paths were smooth. When the legions pushed into wild lands, soldiers often cut their own way through forests, built bridges across rivers, or climbed steep, unforgiving slopes. Mud sucked at their sandals. Rain turned paths into rivers. Snow numbed their feet. The soldier endured it all because the march did not stop for weather or terrain. Rome's strength lay in this endurance, in the knowledge that the legion would arrive, no matter how far, no matter how hard the path. The march was not only physical but mental. The endless repetition of steps, the hours stretching without change, tested the mind as much as the body. A soldier learned to lose himself in rhythm. Left foot, right foot, breath in, breath out. The weight pressed down, but the march carried him forward. Some men whispered songs to themselves, some hummed softly, some simply counted steps until numbers blurred into silence. In this way, the march became almost meditative, a discipline that stripped away distraction and forced endurance. When breaks came, they were short and practical. Packs were lowered, water skins shared, bread chewed quickly, sandals adjusted. Men rubbed their feet, knowing blisters could ruin more than comfort. They could ruin the pace of the entire unit. Officers watched carefully, ensuring no man lagged, for the march was only as strong as its slowest step. Then, with little pause, the command came again, and the line rose as one, shoulders tightening beneath the weight, feet striking forward once more. Evenings on the march did not bring rest immediately. When the day's distance was done, the soldiers built their own security before they could sleep. Each night a new camp was raised, ditches dug, palisades erected, tents pitched. The work was done with the same discipline as the march itself, for the legion never left itself unguarded. Only after the camp stood did the men sit by fires, remove their sandals, and eat their coarse bread. Sleep came quickly, for dawn would bring the march again. The endless miles forged unity as much as battles did. A man who marched beside another for weeks learned the rhythm of his steps, the way he shifted his pack, the sound of his breathing. Bonds of companionship grew not only in the heat of combat, but in the dust of the road, in the silent endurance of hardship shared. These bonds mattered. A legion was not a collection of individuals. It was a single body, bound together by countless miles endured side by side to outsiders. The marches of Rome seemed impossible, almost inhuman. How could men carry such loads, travel such distances, and still fight when needed? Yet to the soldiers, it was simply life. The body hardened, the mind accepted, the routine became as natural as waking. The road was home as much as the camp, the sound of boots on stone as familiar as the sound of voices. The march was not a punishment. It was the heartbeat of the legion. Through these endless miles, Rome extended itself across the world. Borders expanded, provinces secured, roads built, all on the strength of men who walked, day after day, without rest, without complaint. They were not remembered for the number of steps they took, but without those steps, Rome would never have stood. The soldier's march was the empire's lifeblood, flowing through its veins of stone roads, carrying discipline, strength, and endurance farther than any banner alone could reach. And so, when we think of the Roman soldier, we must not only picture him in battle, sword raised, shield locked. We must also see him in the dust of the road, head bowed beneath his helmet, feet striking endlessly against the earth, mile after mile. For in those quiet, unending marches, the true might of Rome was carried, not in glory, not in triumph, but in silence, in discipline, in the steady rhythm of men who walked until the empire itself seemed to move with them. If the Roman soldier was known for anything, it was discipline, not the kind of discipline shouted in anger, nor the kind punished with fear alone, but the kind built through endless repetition, through practice so thorough that movement became instinct, reaction became nature, and obedience became as natural as breath. A legionary was not born ready to hold a shield wall or to march 20 miles without complaint. He was shaped, molded by training so steady and so relentless that even the smallest detail became second nature. This training was not glamorous. It was not filled with stories of heroism or victories. It was slow, hard, monotonous work, performed day after day beneath the watchful eyes of centurions who demanded nothing less than perfection. And it was in this slow grind that Rome's armies gained their edge. The drills began in the earliest days of a soldier's service. Recruits, often young men drawn from farms, towns, and provinces, were first introduced not to real weapons, but to wooden ones. Heavy, oversized swords and javelins were placed in their hands, deliberately heavier than the real thing. To swing them was exhausting. To thrust them required strength. To hold them steady demanded control. Every stroke, every thrust, every motion was repeated until muscles burned, then repeated again. The purpose was clear. If a man could master the heavy wooden sword, then the real gladius, short and sharp, would feel light in his grip, its movements swift and precise. This training stripped away weakness, replacing it with endurance, until even the simplest strike carried practiced certainty. Shields, too, were practiced endlessly. Soldiers drilled not only in individual defense, but in formation, for the strength of the legion lay not in one man's arm, but in the unity of many. Men learned to lock shields side by side, to step forward together, to hold lines firm against pressure. They practiced advancing as a wall, kneeling in the front rank while those behind thrust their spears above them, lifting shields overhead in the famous testudo, or tortoise formation, creating a shell of protection against arrows. These maneuvers were not taught once and then left behind. They were repeated daily, until each soldier knew his place as naturally as he knew his own name. To step out of line was to break the strength of all, and so drills taught him not only to fight, but to trust and depend on his comrades. Marching itself was part of the discipline. It was not enough to walk from one place to another. Soldiers drilled at marching pace, sometimes burdened with full packs, sometimes with added weights, trained to cover long distances without faltering. They marched in silence, in formation, practicing the same order they would hold in battle. Centurions set the rhythm, their voices or staffs striking the pace, ensuring that the line moved as one body. To the recruit, the endless march was grueling. To the trained soldier, it became second nature. And in this way, Rome's armies gained an advantage over enemies who tired more quickly, who faltered in their steps, who lacked the endurance drilled into every Roman. Discipline extended beyond weapons and marches. Soldiers trained in digging trenches, in raising palisades, in building camps with speed and efficiency. A legion was expected to fortify itself every night, no matter how long the day's march. Recruits were drilled in these tasks until their hands knew the weight of shovels as well as swords, until they could raise defenses in hours that others would take days to complete. This constant preparation turned the Legion into more than an army of fighters. It turned them into builders, engineers, laborers who could create order in any landscape. The centurion, the backbone of Roman discipline, stood at the heart of these drills. He carried a vine staff, a symbol of authority, and used it freely on those who faltered. His voice carried across the training ground, sharp, commanding, leaving no room for hesitation. To the soldier, the centurion was both feared and respected, for he represented the standard to which all must rise. And yet, beyond the harshness, there was also pride. A centurion who demanded perfection forged soldiers who could endure, who could hold the line when chaos threatened to break it. He was the embodiment of Rome's discipline, and his men were the proof of its success. Training did not end once a soldier was considered ready. It never ended. Even veterans drilled daily, repeating maneuvers, sharpening movements, keeping their bodies and minds alert. A Roman soldier could spend more days drilling than fighting, his life shaped not by the glory of battle, but by the quiet grind of preparation. This endless practice ensured that when the moment of battle did come, when noise and fear filled the air, his body acted without thought. The shield rose instinctively, the sword struck without hesitation, the formation held firm even as arrows fell. Discipline replaced fear, and training replaced panic. What outsiders often failed to understand was that this discipline was Rome's greatest weapon. Enemies might have larger armies, might carry fiercer weapons, might shout louder on the battlefield. But when faced with a Roman legion, they faced not individuals, but a machine built through repetition, unity, and obedience. Each man's action was predictable to his comrades, each movement part of a greater pattern. This cohesion, drilled day after day, gave the legion a strength far greater than the sum of its parts. For the soldier himself, drills were both a burden and a source of pride. The endless repetition wore at the body, the harsh discipline of centurions stung the spirit, yet beneath it all was the knowledge that he was part of something larger. His endurance, his precision, his obedience made him more than a man with a sword. It made him a piece of Rome's living wall of steel. And when he stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, when the formation moved as one, he felt the strength that no individual could claim alone. Thus, the drills and discipline of the Roman soldier were not only preparation for war. They were his life, his identity, his duty. Each day he rose, he trained. Each day he repeated movements that seemed endless, meaningless in isolation. Yet together, these movements shaped the army that held an empire for centuries. The Roman soldier did not conquer through bravery alone. He conquered through discipline, steady, relentless, unshakable. And in the quiet grind of drills, in the endless rhythm of training fields, the might of Rome was forged. For the Roman soldier, not every day brought the clash of swords, the sting of marching dust, or the weight of drills that burned the body into obedience. Often, his greatest challenge was silence. Guard duty, the long hours spent standing watch over a camp, a fortress, or a lonely outpost, was as much a part of his life as battle or marching. It was work that demanded no noise, no movement, no glory. Yet it was here, in the stillness of the night or the slow passage of the day, that discipline was tested most deeply. For armies do not survive on victories alone. They survive on vigilance. And vigilance, for the Roman soldier, meant the quiet endurance of guard duty. Every camp, no matter how temporary, was circled by defenses, ditches dug into the earth, palisades of sharpened stakes, gates set with heavy guards. These were not merely symbolic. They were the line between safety and destruction. The soldier who stood at those gates or along those walls carried more than his own life in his vigilance. He carried the life of the entire legion. If he faltered, if he let his eyes close or his mind wander, an enemy could slip through the darkness, and disaster could follow. This knowledge weighed heavily, pressing into every moment of the watch, reminding the soldier that silence was never emptiness. Silence was responsibility. Guard duty was divided into watches, marked by the sounding of horns or the striking of signals. In a single night, soldiers rotated through several shifts, each lasting a few hours. Some stood in the early evening, when the camp settled into rest and fires burned low. Others were called in the dead of night, when exhaustion pressed hardest and the darkness seemed endless. The hardest watch of all came in the hours before dawn, when the body longed most for sleep, when even the stars seemed to fade and the cold of morning cut deepest. To endure these hours without faltering was one of the quiet proofs of a soldier's discipline. The duties themselves were simple to describe, but heavy to bear. A guard stood at his post, shield at his side, spear or sword ready, eyes scanning the horizon, ears straining for sound. He could not sit. He could not wander. He could not pass the time with idle chatter. He remained still, watching, listening, his mind fighting the weight of fatigue. The camp around him might be silent, filled with the breathing of thousands of sleeping comrades, but he could not join them. He had to remain awake, a single flame of awareness in the dark. The silence of watch duty was filled with its own kind of sounds, the rustle of wind through grass, the distant call of animals, the creak of wood in the palisade, the crackle of a dying fire. Each sound carried weight, each one examined for danger. Was that the footstep of an enemy, or only the shifting of a branch? Was that movement in the shadows a threat, or only the play of the moonlight? The soldier learned to live in this tension, never allowing his mind to sink into comfort, never trusting silence too easily. Punishments for failure were severe, for failure on guard duty endangered all. To fall asleep at a post was one of the gravest crimes a soldier could commit. Entire units could be punished for the weakness of one, beaten or disgraced for a lapse of vigilance. The Roman army's discipline demanded that no man ever forget the weight of his watch, and so fear itself became another companion on those long nights. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of failing his comrades. And yet, alongside this fear, there was also a strange calm. For hours, a soldier stood alone with his thoughts. The world narrowed to the edge of torchlight or the shimmer of the stars. Some men found comfort in this solitude, whispering quiet prayers to themselves, remembering home, or simply letting their minds drift while their bodies remained alert. Others found it unbearable, the silence pressing heavier than any armor. But all learned to endure it, because endurance was the heart of their life. During the day, guard duty took another shape. Soldiers watched gates, checked travelers, controlled the flow of people and goods in and out of the camp or fort. They inspected merchants bringing supplies, turned away strangers without leave, and noted the comings and goings of officers and messengers. It was less lonely than the night watch, but no less important, for an army's order depended on the control of its gates. A careless guard could allow a spy to enter, or let disorder spread. Guard duty also extended beyond the camp. Small groups of soldiers were sent to watch crossroads, bridges, or farmlands near the army station. These posts were often more dangerous, isolated from the safety of the legion's numbers, exposed to attack or ambush. To stand guard at such places was to live with the constant edge of danger, to know that silence could be broken at any moment by sudden violence. And yet soldiers did it without hesitation, because the empire demanded eyes everywhere, and because a legion's strength lay not only in battle but in its constant awareness of the world around it. For the soldier himself, guard duty became another rhythm of life. Just as he grew used to the weight of armor, the repetition of drills, the monotony of food, he grew used to the silence of the watch. His body learned to endure the cold, his eyes learned to see in half light, His mind learned to balance between alertness and the pull of exhaustion. It was not glorious, and it was rarely remembered, but it was essential. A legion could fight only because its soldiers first kept watch. Through countless nights, across endless miles, in silence that stretched longer than any battle ever could, in the end, guard duty was more than a task. It was a test of discipline, of loyalty, of the ability to carry the weight of responsibility even when no one was watching. It reminded the soldier that he was not only a fighter but a guardian, not only a man with a sword but a wall standing between his comrades and danger. And as he stood there, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, ears straining for the faintest sound, he embodied the truth of Rome's endurance. Empires are not only built in victories, but in the quiet vigilance of men who stay awake when others sleep. The image of a Roman soldier often brings to mind the weight of armor, the sharp gladius at his side, the great shield carried into battle. Yet for every hour spent fighting, there were countless hours spent building. A Roman soldier was not only a warrior, he was a craftsman, a laborer, and an engineer. The empire's strength rested as much on ditches and walls as on swords and spears. To march was to prepare for war, but to survive was to build. And in this, the legionaries proved themselves tireless every evening. After long marches that carried them across miles of stone roads and dusty fields, the soldiers did not collapse into sleep. Instead, they began their work again, this time with tools rather than weapons. The order to halt was not the end of the day, but the beginning of a new task, raising the camp. And this was no small thing. The Roman army never slept unprotected. Even a single night on open ground meant walls, gates, and defenses, all built with the hands of soldiers who carried shovels and picks alongside swords. The process was methodical, almost ritual. First came the layout, designed with geometric precision. Surveyors marked the ground, measuring distances, aligning streets, and assigning plots. The camp was not thrown together in chaos. It was planned as carefully as a city. Streets ran straight and orderly. Gates were placed at fixed points. The commander's tent stood in the center, surrounded by the quarters of officers, the storage of supplies, and the lines of soldiers' tents. Each man knew his place, and every camp, no matter how temporary, resembled the last. This familiarity gave comfort as well as security. A soldier who awoke in a camp hundreds of miles from home still knew where to find his comrades, where to walk, where to stand guard. Then came the labor itself. Soldiers dug ditches, wide and deep, throwing the soil inward to form ramparts. Into these ramparts they set stakes, sharpened and driven firmly into the earth, forming palisades that bristled like teeth. Gates were built at precise points, reinforced with timber, guarded with care. Watchtowers rose where needed, and fires were lit to mark the perimeter. In a matter of hours, what had been empty ground became a fortress of earth and wood, strong enough to deter sudden attack, secure enough to give rest to thousands. The speed with which this work was done astonished Rome's enemies, who could scarcely believe that so vast a camp could rise in a single evening. Yet for the soldiers, it was routine, performed with the same discipline as drills or marches. This work was not easy. The tools were heavy, the soil often hard, the hours long. Muscles already weary from the march burned again as men dug and hauled. Yet there was no complaint. Each soldier understood that this labor was not only for himself, but for his comrades. A wall half built endangered all. A gate left weak put every life at risk. And so they worked in silence or with low murmurs, the rhythm of shovels and picks blending with the fading light of day, the air filled with the smell of sweat and soil. By nightfall, a safe haven stood where only open ground had been. Beyond camps, the Roman soldier also built roads. These roads, stretching straight across mountains, forests, and plains, were the veins of the empire, carrying supplies, messengers, and armies swiftly to where they were needed. To build them required backbreaking labor. Soldiers cut through forests, leveled ground, laid stones in precise layers, large rocks at the base, gravel above, then paving stones fitted so tightly that centuries later, many still endure. These roads were not only for Rome's armies. They were gifts and chains alike, binding provinces to the empire, allowing trade to flow, but also ensuring that Rome could always reach them swiftly with legions. And every step of their creation was laid with the sweat of soldiers who swung picks as tirelessly as they thrust swords. Fortifications, too, bore their mark. Along frontiers, soldiers built walls of stone and timber, forts that housed garrisons for years, and watchtowers that kept vigilant eyes over distant lands. These were not the work of specialized builders alone. They were raised by the very men who lived within them, soldiers who could turn from labor to battle at a moment's notice. A Roman soldier's hands bore calluses from more than weapons. They bore the rough scars of tools, of ropes pulled tight, of wood and stone lifted into place. To build was not a separate duty. It was part of the identity of the legion itself. This dual life, warrior and builder, gave the Roman army an advantage no enemy could match. Where others might collapse from exhaustion, Rome's soldiers raised walls. Where others camped in the open, Rome's soldiers slept behind ditches and palisades. Where others struggled with poor paths, Rome's soldiers laid roads that carried armies like rivers of stone. And all of it was done not by slaves, not by servants, but by the soldiers themselves, whose discipline turned them into the most versatile force of their age. For the soldier, the work shaped his days as much as battle did. He learned to wield a shovel as skillfully as a sword, to raise a tent with the same precision as he raised his shield, to see the building of a camp not as drudgery, but as survival. He took pride in the speed with which his unit could transform empty land into a fortress, in the roads that stretched behind him like lines carved into the earth, in the knowledge that wherever Rome marched, order followed. And so, the daily life of the Roman soldier was not filled only with noise and blood. It was filled also with the scrape of shovels, the clatter of stones, the smell of fresh-cut timber, the sight of walls rising from the ground. These acts of craft and construction, repeated across years and lands, were the quiet labor that built an empire. For in the end, Rome's strength was not only in how it fought, but in how it built, and the soldiers who bore both sword and shovel were the living proof of that strength. When the sun sank low and the last strokes of labor ended, when the walls of the day's camp were built and the gates secured, a different kind of rhythm began. The Roman soldier, who had marched for miles, dug trenches, raised palisades, and carried the burden of armor, at last entered the quietest part of his day, the evening in camp. Yet even this rest was not idleness. It was structured, shared, and filled with the small acts of humanity that made the burden of military life bearable. For all the harshness of their existence, evenings offered a pause, a chance for men to remember they were not only soldiers of an empire, but also human beings. Bound together in the glow of firelight, the camp, by evening, was transformed. What had been empty land at dusk now stood as an orderly city of canvas and timber. Rows of tents stretched like streets, fires flickered at regular intervals, and the air filled with the scents of smoke, grain, and stew. The gates were guarded, the ditches watched, but within the walls, a kind of calm settled. Soldiers gathered in their contubernia, the small groups of 8 men who shared tents, food, and burdens. Around their fires, they cooked what little they had. Bread warmed on stones, porridge thickened in pots, perhaps a handful of beans, or if fortune smiled, a scrap of meat purchased from locals or shared from a hunt. The meals were plain, yet the act of cooking together gave comfort, a reminder that even in the most distant outpost, men could share warmth and nourishment. The evening meal was slow compared to the hurried bites taken on the march. Soldiers sat on low stools or simply on the earth, breaking bread, passing bowls, dipping crusts into stews, drinking watered wine from cups that bore the marks of long use. They spoke softly, their voices weaving with the crackle of fire, their words carrying the rhythm of fatigue, but also of release. They joked, they teased, they retold the day's hardships in tones made lighter by survival. Laughter was quiet, but real, a small rebellion against the weight of discipline that ruled the day. After eating, the camp grew more alive. Fires burned brighter, casting light that danced on the walls of tents and the faces of weary men. Some sharpened weapons, the scrape of whetstone against iron steady and rhythmic. Others mended sandals or repaired straps, their hands busy even as their minds drifted. These tasks were done in silence or in conversation, the atmosphere one of steady calm. For the soldier, evening was not an escape from work, but a change in its pace, a gentler rhythm that allowed for reflection. Yet evenings were not only for labor. They were also for stories. Men told tales of home, of farms left behind, of cities far away. They spoke of families waiting in distant provinces, of childhood games played in fields, of festivals that once filled their towns with music. For many, these stories were the only way to keep alive the memory of a world beyond the march. Others told stories of war, of past battles fought, of narrow escapes, of comrades remembered. These tales carried both pride and sorrow, binding men together in shared history. Around the fire, a soldier could feel that he belonged not only to an army, but to a brotherhood of memory. Music, too, filled the night. Soldiers carried small instruments, pipes, flutes, simple drums, and in the quiet hours, melodies rose into the air. The tunes were not grand or polished, but they brought comfort. A man might hum softly as he cleaned his armor. Another might sing a song from his village, and soon the group would join, voices blending into a chorus that carried across the camp. These songs reminded them that they were more than iron and drills. They were men of flesh and feeling, capable of beauty even in the shadow of war. The fires themselves were companions. Men sat close to their warmth, staring into the flames, letting their minds wander. The dance of firelight on the faces of comrades created a kind of intimacy, a shared silence that needed no words. Around the fire, soldiers could find peace, if only for a short time, before the duties of the next day began again. Evenings also brought small rituals. Dice games were common, played on simple boards scratched into the earth. Wagers were placed, coins or small belongings exchanged, laughter rising when fortune turned suddenly. These games were more than entertainment. They were a release, a way to momentarily forget the endless marches, the drills, the weight of armor. They were also lessons in chance, reminders that fortune could change as suddenly on the battlefield as it did in the throw of dice. Letters were written, too, by the firelight. Soldiers who could write, or who had comrades willing to write for them, put words on wax tablets or scraps of parchment, messages to families far away. They wrote of health, of daily routines, of longing for home. These letters traveled slowly, carried by couriers across the empire, but they were lifelines, threads that tied men to lives beyond the camp. For the soldier, writing was not only communication, it was hope. Not all evenings were joyful. Some were heavy with silence, with the weight of loss or exhaustion. When comrades had fallen, their absence was felt most keenly at the fire, where their voices no longer joined in laughter, where their places stood empty. In such moments, stories turned into remembrance, songs softened into laments. The fire became not only warmth, but also a place of mourning, a way to honor those who would never sit there again. And yet, no matter the mood, the evening always ended the same. The fires burned lower. Men lay down on straw bedding in their tents, shields stacked nearby, armor within reach. The murmur of voices faded into the quiet of sleep. Outside, guards kept watch, their silhouettes steady against the dim light of torches. Inside, thousands of soldiers rested, their breathing mingling into a steady rhythm. The camp itself becoming a living organism that slept in parts while others remained awake. Evenings in the Roman camp were not moments of luxury or leisure as we might imagine them. They were simple, structured, filled with the ordinary acts of cooking, eating, talking, repairing, and remembering. But in these small acts lay the humanity of the soldier. For all his drills, his marches, his armor, and his burdens, he was still a man who laughed with his comrades, who sang songs of home, who stared into flames and let his mind wander. The fires, the songs, the stories gave him strength as surely as bread or training. They were the quiet balance to the hardness of the day, the reminder that even in the heart of empire, even in the silence of duty, life carried warmth. And so, night after night, across countless miles and countless years, the Roman soldiers' evenings repeated, fires rising against the dark, voices blending in song, dice clattering on earth, stories whispered of home, laughter shared, silences endured. These were not the moments of history that empires record, yet without them, no army could have endured. For it was in these evenings, in the glow of firelight and the rhythm of humanity, that the legionary remembered why he endured, not for glory alone, but for the bond of men who faced the same endless days, the same heavy marches, the same distant dreams. Life in the Roman legion often felt as though it stretched far beyond the reach of ordinary human life. Soldiers marched through distant lands, their feet pressing into soil that was strange to them, their eyes seeing landscapes unlike those of their birth. They built camps in forests where no road had yet been laid, stood watch over rivers whose names they barely knew, and fought battles against peoples whose languages they could not understand. Yet for all the vastness of the empire, for all the distances covered, a Roman soldier was never free of one truth. He had come from somewhere. He had a family, a village, a street, a hearth left behind. And in the long silence of the camp, in the evenings spent by flickering fires, his thoughts wandered back to that place. The connection to home was fragile, stretched thin across miles of road and sea, but it remained, carried in letters and memory, and in the quiet rituals of remembrance that tied him to the world he had left. Letters were the most tangible lifeline. Not every soldier could write, but those who could often wrote for others, turning one man's hand into the voice of many. A wax tablet or scrap of parchment was precious, worth more than its weight in coin, because upon it a soldier could place his thoughts, his greetings, his assurances that he was alive. He might write of daily routines, of bread and gruel, of drills and marches, of the building of camps. He might tell of comrades, of laughter shared by the fire, of songs sung in distant lands. He might write of longing, for the sight of his mother's face, for the voice of a wife, for the laughter of children. He might send word of coins saved, promising that his pay would reach home when messengers carried it. In each line, he reached across the silence of miles, hoping his words would one day rest in the hands of those he loved. The letters that returned to camp were treasures. When a courier arrived bearing messages from faraway towns and villages, the air shifted. Hardened men, weary from labor and watch, waited with quiet eagerness, eyes searching for their names. To receive a letter was to be pulled back into another world, a world of vineyards and fields, of markets and hearths, of streets where children played. The words might be simple, scratched in uneven hands, yet they carried a weight no armor could match. A soldier who read his wife's words, who heard of the health of his children, who learned that the fields had yielded a harvest, was given a moment of peace in the middle of war. That small fragment of home, carried in ink, could sustain him through endless marches, but letters were slow, uncertain things. They traveled across provinces by horse, cart, or ship, vulnerable to weather, to robbery, to delay. Weeks could pass, months even, before words reached their destination, and sometimes they never did. A soldier might write faithfully, pouring his thoughts onto a tablet, yet never know if his words were read. A family might send their love, yet never be certain it arrived. This uncertainty weighed heavily, turning memory into an even more vital companion. For when letters could not bridge the distance, memory did. Memory lived in the quiet moments of the camp. A soldier might close his eyes by the fire and see again the narrow street where he had played as a boy. He might hear the echo of a father's voice, recall the scent of bread from his mother's oven, remember the laughter of siblings. These images came unbidden, sometimes sharp, sometimes softened by time, but always present. They gave strength when marches grew endless, when nights on watch stretched too long, when the silence of the frontier pressed too heavily. In the solitude of memory, he found pieces of himself that no battle could erase. Some men carried tokens as anchors to these memories. A small charm, a scrap of cloth, a carving of wood. Simple things, but heavy with meaning. They kept them hidden in pouches, tucked among their gear, close to the body. To touch them in moments of fatigue was to feel, if only faintly, the presence of home. Others carved marks into their equipment, symbols that reminded them of villages or families. Even their tattoos, sometimes, bore shapes that tied them not only to the brotherhood of soldiers, but also to the identities they had carried before. These tokens were private, rarely spoken of, yet deeply cherished. Evenings in the camp became moments of shared memory. Around fires, men spoke of their homes, of fields they had tilled, of rivers they had fished, of markets where they had walked. They described the taste of food not found in the camp, the colors of festivals, the warmth of voices. They told stories of wives, of mothers, of children waiting. These stories brought laughter, sometimes sorrow, but always connection. To speak of home was to remind oneself that there was more than marching and fighting, that beyond the horizon lay a life worth enduring for. Comrades listened, each adding their own fragments, until the fireside became a tapestry of distant towns and villages, woven together by words. Yet memory was not always gentle. For some, the thought of home carried pain. Soldiers who had been gone for years sometimes feared they would return to find loved ones lost, fields abandoned, children grown without them. Letters that spoke of hardship, of sickness, of loss, cut deeper than any wound of battle. In these moments, the soldier's connection to home was a burden as much as a comfort. But even then, he clung to it. For to lose that connection entirely would be to lose himself. The Roman army, disciplined as it was, understood the importance of these ties. Pay was sent regularly, systems were built to ensure that families received support, and couriers carried letters whenever possible. It was not kindness alone, but practicality. An army whose men felt abandoned would not fight with endurance. An army whose men believed their homes were safe and remembered fought with greater strength. Rome knew that loyalty was not built on duty alone, but also on the fragile thread of memory that in the end, the Roman soldier's connection to home was not measured only in letters or tokens. It lived in his heart, in the way he carried himself, in the hope that every march, every battle, every hardship brought him closer to return. He fought not only for pay, not only for the empire, but also for the streets and fields of memory, for the faces that waited in the distance. And though he might never know if his words arrived, though he might never again walk those streets, he carried them always, across every mile, into every watch, through every silence. Thus, the life of the Roman soldier was not only iron and dust, it was also memory, fragile and enduring, that tied him to home. His letters, his stories, his tokens, his quiet thoughts by the fire. These were the invisible armor that protected him against despair. And in the endless march of empire, in the noise of war, in the silence of camps, the soldier's heart remained bound by those distant places, those remembered voices. For Rome's legions may have conquered the world, but within each man lived another, smaller world, one carried always in memory. When the final flames of the campfires dimmed, when the dice had been put away, when songs had softened into silence, the Roman camp entered its last rhythm of the day, rest. And yet, even this rest was not the rest of freedom. It was ordered, structured, watched over, for the Roman legion never allowed itself to sink fully into the embrace of sleep. The soldier who lay down beneath canvas or sky did so with armor stacked beside him, shield within reach, weapons ready for the call that might come before dawn. For though the stars shone above in quiet indifference, the soldier slept in a world of duty, his body seeking peace while his mind remained tethered to discipline. The layout of the camp itself shaped this rest. Every quintubernium, 8 men bound together in a tent, settled into a space barely large enough to contain them. Straw bedding was spread thin, blankets pulled close against the cold, sandals tucked carefully at the feet, gear stacked at the head. Each man knew where his place was, as surely as he knew his place in the line of march or the shield wall. There was no luxury of choosing one spot. Order governed even the silence of sleep, for chaos in the smallest detail could ripple outward, weakening the discipline that held the legion together. The air of the camp at night carried a different weight. The smoke of dying fires mingled with the smell of sweat, leather, and iron. The quiet murmur of men settling into sleep faded until only the sounds of breathing filled the tent. Outside, guards walked their watch, torches glowing faintly at the gates, their footsteps steady reminders that vigilance never ended. For those within the tents, the knowledge of these sentinels gave a fragile sense of safety. They could close their eyes not because danger was gone, but because someone else had taken on the burden of watching. Sleep did not always come easily. The straw bedding was rough, the ground beneath unforgiving, the weight of marches and labor pressing heavily into muscles. Many soldiers lay awake for long moments, staring at the faint outlines of their comrades in the darkness, letting their thoughts drift. They thought of home, of letters written, of voices remembered. They thought of the miles yet to march, of the orders that might come with the morning. The silence was both comfort and burden. It gave space for memory, but it also carried the weight of uncertainty. And yet, exhaustion was its own master. After long days of marching 20 miles or digging ditches until hands blistered, sleep took the soldier whether he sought it or not. His body surrendered, his breathing slowed, his mind sank into the rhythm of dreams. But even in dreams, the soldier was not free. The clatter of drills, the calls of centurions, the endless road often followed him into sleep. His rest was not always peaceful, but it was enough. For the legion did not demand comfort. It demanded endurance. The stars above, distant and unmoved, became companions of a kind. In places far from cities, where darkness was deep and unbroken, the heavens spread in vast patterns, their constellations unfamiliar yet eternal. Many soldiers, lying just outside their tents or during nights when the air was too warm for canvas, looked upward and let their thoughts drift into the sky. For a moment, beneath those stars, they were reminded of their smallness, of the vastness of the world, of the fragility of human toil beneath the endless dome of night. The same stars shone over their homes, over their families far away, and in this, there was a thread of connection, a silent comfort that needed no words. Night in camp was not entirely still. Guards changed shifts, their movements marked by the calls of horns. The occasional cry of an animal in the distance broke the silence. A soldier turned in his sleep, muttered in dreams, shifted his blanket. Fires were stoked softly to keep embers alive. The night was a living thing, breathing slowly, holding thousands of men within its embrace. And yet, through it all, the order of the Legion remained. No chaos, no disarray, only the steady rhythm of rest bound by duty. Sleep was not always gentle. There were nights when storms rolled in, rain pounding against canvas, lightning illuminating the camp in sudden flashes. Tents leaked, blankets grew damp, mud seeped beneath bedding. Still, the soldier endured, curling into his cloak, letting exhaustion carry him despite discomfort. Other nights brought heat, insects, the endless buzzing of life around him. Still, he endured, for the soldier had no choice but to find rest in whatever form it came. His body learned to take sleep where it could, whether on straw, on bare earth, or even sitting upright against a shield. What made these nights bearable was not comfort, but companionship. 8 men packed tightly into a tent shared warmth as well as space. They shifted to make room, shared blankets when cold cut too deeply, lent cloaks when one had none. The quiet intimacy of shared sleep created bonds as strong as those forged in battle. A soldier might not speak of it, but he knew that the men who slept beside him were the same who would stand beside him tomorrow, who would march with him, who would shield him in battle. The trust built in silence was as vital as the trust built in war. Morning always came too soon. Trumpets cut through dreams. Officers' voices stirred men from slumber. Fires were stoked once more. The soldier who had just closed his eyes felt the pull of fatigue still heavy, but he rose without hesitation. There was no space for lingering. Blankets were folded, sandals laced, gear checked. Sleep was not an escape, but a pause. And the pause was always brief, for the march, the drill, the labor waited beyond dawn. And yet, despite its brevity, despite its discomfort, sleep under the stars carried its own kind of meaning. It reminded the soldier of his humanity, of his need for rest, of the small mercy of silence between one day and the next. Beneath the sky, among comrades, with shield and sword close at hand, he found enough peace to continue. And that was all the Legion demanded. Not perfect rest, not luxury, but enough strength to rise again and take another step, to lift another shield, to endure another day. Thus, the Roman soldiers' nights were woven of exhaustion, memory, companionship, and discipline. They were not gentle, but they were steady, repeated across years and lands, from the forests of the north to the deserts of the east. Sleep under the stars was not the absence of duty, but its silent companion, the pause that made endurance possible. And in that pause, brief though it was, Rome renewed its strength. For empires are not carried only by victories. They are carried, too, by men who sleep when they can, beneath stars that shine indifferently, before rising once more to march into the endless day. Our journey into the daily life of a Roman soldier now draws to its close. We have walked with him from the moment he woke in the chill of dawn, folding his blanket and lacing his sandals, to the long marches that tested his endurance, to the drills that shaped his discipline, to the evenings of laughter and song around the fire, and finally to the quiet rest beneath the stars. What we have seen is not the story of grand battles or triumphant conquests, but the quieter truth that made such victories possible. Rome did not endure because of emperors alone, nor because of generals whose names filled histories. It endured because ordinary men rose each morning, carried their burdens, ate their coarse bread, dug their trenches, stood their watches, built their camps, and marched mile after mile with discipline unbroken. It endured because men learned to sleep in discomfort, to laugh in hardship, to find strength in companionship. The empire was built not only by swords, but by shovels, by sandals, by shields stacked neatly beside tired men in tents. And so, as you rest now, imagine the campfire's glow fading into darkness, the stars above steady and bright, the breathing of comrades blending into a single rhythm. Imagine the quiet strength of men who endured not for glory, but for survival, for duty, for the bonds that tied them together. Their lives remind us that history is not only the noise of battle, but also the silence between, the silence of watch, of work, of sleep. If you have found calm in this journey through the forgotten rhythms of ancient life, remember to like and subscribe so the next story may find you again. For now, let the noise of your day drift away. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the steady footsteps of Rome's soldiers carry you gently into rest. The empire may have passed, but its quiet routines remain, waiting in memory, like the stars that still shine above us all.